In December 1895, a logging camp near Mount Rainier reported something impossible to the territorial marshal. 7 men had vanished in 3 days. Their axes were found standing upright in perfect circles around enormous tree stumps. But the trees themselves had been split lengthwise, torn apart from the inside. The camp foreman's final telegram read, "He's still cutting. God help us, he won't stop cutting." The Washington Territory's timber industry operated under brutal conditions that killed men as efficiently as it felled trees. Logging camps stretched across the Cascade foothills, isolated by weeks of travel from the nearest settlements. Men worked 14-hour days in freezing temperatures. Their survival depended on company stores that charged triple for basic supplies. Camp superintendents maintained detailed production logs, and these records from the Cascade Timber Company's Camp 7 reveal something the official histories deliberately omitted. Thomas Milner arrived at Camp 7 in October 1895. The company ledger lists him as 32 years old, previously employed at camps in Oregon and Northern California. His references described exceptional strength and an unusual work ethic. The camp foreman, a man named Donald Reeves, noted in his weekly report that Milner could fell a Douglas fir in half the time of experienced crews. What Reeves didn't report was Milner's insistence on working alone, or the way other loggers refused to work near him after the first week. A logger named Patrick O'Sullivan kept a diary that survived in his family's possession. His entry from October 28th describes Milner's technique in detail. O'Sullivan watched from a distance as Milner approached a massive cedar, studying it for nearly an hour before making his first cut. When he finally began, the rhythm was unlike anything the veteran loggers had witnessed. Each strike landed with mechanical precision, the same force, the same angle, the same point of impact. O'Sullivan counted the blows during a dinner break. 47 strikes to the exact same spot before the tree fell. What disturbed him more was the sound. Most loggers varied their rhythm naturally, took breaks to catch their breath, adjusted their stance. Milner never varied. The sound of his axe became a metronome in the forest, steady and inhuman in its consistency. "Jimmy says it ain't natural," O'Sullivan wrote. Says he watched Milner work through the night once, could hear the axe from his bunk, same rhythm for hours, never slowing, never stopping. When Jimmy went to check on him at dawn, Milner hadn't moved positions. The ground around him was covered in wood chips 3 feet deep, but Milner himself looked fresh as if he'd just started. No sweat, no fatigue, just that rhythm, continuing without end. The camp operated on a quota system that kept men trapped in cycles of debt and exhaustion. Each crew needed to fell and process a minimum number of trees weekly or face reduced rations and wage penalties. Most crews barely met these quotas, working themselves to collapse in the attempt. Production records show Milner consistently exceeded quotas by impossible margins. Where a typical logger might fell 3 to 4 trees daily, Milner's personal tally reached 15 to 20. The superintendent noted this as exceptional productivity in his reports to company headquarters in Seattle, recommended Milner for a crew foreman position. But productivity wasn't the only thing other loggers noticed about Milner. He worked sites no one else would touch, areas where the forest grew dense and ancient, where trees stood so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor. Old-growth timber that required coordinated crew efforts to safely fell. Milner went alone into these sections, stayed for days at a time, emerged with cutting tallies that should have been impossible for a single man. By mid-November, other details emerged in the camp correspondence. A letter from camp cook Samuel Chen to his brother in Tacoma mentioned that Milner never attended meals. The cook maintained strict schedules, rang a bell that echoed through the cutting sites to call men back for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Every logger returned when summoned. Every logger except Milner. "He takes his food to the cutting sites," Chen wrote. "I prepare his rations same as the others, but he insists on carrying them into the forest. When I deliver his next day's food, I find the previous day's rations untouched, spoiled in the cold. I mentioned this to Donald Reeves, suggested Milner might be ill, refusing food due to sickness, but Reeves just laughed. Said to look at the man. Milner shows no signs of hunger or weakness. If anything, he grows stronger. His arms have gotten thicker, his shoulders broader. He's putting on muscle while the rest of us waste away on short rations. The camp's company doctor, a man named Albert Fisher, who visited monthly to treat injuries and assess worker health, noted similar observations in his November 12th report. During a routine examination, Fisher recorded Milner's physical condition as exceptional. Heart rate slower than normal, breathing patterns unusual, but overall health superior to any logger he'd examined in 15 years of camp work. What Fisher found peculiar was Milner's hands. Despite weeks of constant axe work, the skin showed no blisters, no calluses, no damage. The hands looked smooth, almost polished, as if the friction of wood and axe handle had worn the flesh down to something harder underneath. The first disappearance occurred on November 19th. A young logger named Michael Stevens failed to return from his cutting site. Stevens was 23, fresh from a farm in the Willamette Valley, working his first season to earn money for his upcoming marriage. He'd been assigned a section of second-growth timber, easy cutting that foremen typically reserved for inexperienced men. When he didn't return for dinner, Reeves organized a search party. They found his station abandoned as night fell. His axe stood driven into a stump with such force that 3 men couldn't pull it free. They eventually had to dig around the stump's base and split the wood to retrieve the tool. Stevens's coat hung from a nearby branch, though temperatures had dropped below freezing. His lunch pail sat unopened. His water flask remained full. Everything suggested he'd simply vanished mid-swing. The search party's report noted unusual markings on surrounding trees, deep cuts forming patterns none of the loggers recognized. Reeves initially suggested they might be territorial markers from local tribes, though no tribes maintained camps in that area. The cuts were too deliberate, too precise to be random damage. They formed interconnected symbols that spiraled around tree trunks, always at the same height, always carved with the same depth. One detail the official report omitted: the cuts were fresh. The exposed wood still oozed sap, still showed the pale color of recent damage. But Stevens's axe had been buried in the stump. He couldn't have made those marks. Someone else had been there, working the trees while Stevens disappeared. What you need to understand about territorial logging camps is their isolation created its own form of law. Camp superintendents held absolute authority over their men, and disappearances weren't uncommon. Men fled debts, deserted to avoid company obligations, or simply died in accidents the camps never reported to avoid legal complications and work stoppages. The Territorial Marshal's office in Olympia received dozens of missing person reports from timber camps annually, investigated almost none. The camps were too remote, the men too transient, the companies too powerful. Stevens's disappearance would have been recorded as desertion, written off as another young man who couldn't handle the brutal work and fled in the night. Except 2 more men vanished within the next 4 days. Joseph Palmer disappeared on November 21st. William Knox on November 23rd. Both were experienced loggers, married men with families in nearby settlements. Palmer had 3 children waiting for his return. Knox's wife was expecting their first child in spring. Neither had reason to desert. Both had too much invested in their wages to abandon their work. The search party found Palmer's site first, guided by his wife, who traveled from Tacoma when he failed to send his weekly letter. What they discovered defied explanation. Palmer's tools lay arranged in a perfect circle around a massive cedar stump. Each tool pointed inward toward the center, positioned with geometric precision. His axe, his wedges, his saw, his hammer, all aimed at the stump's heart like spokes on a wheel. In the center, someone had driven his felling axe blade deep into the wood, sinking it far past what should have been physically possible. The cedar itself had been split with unnatural precision. Most trees, when cut, fall in the direction of the notch, landing roughly where the logger intends. This cedar had been torn apart along the grain with such force that the 2 halves lay 20 feet apart, splinters jutting 10 feet in the air like wooden spears. The destruction suggested explosive force, as if something had erupted from inside the tree. O'Sullivan's diary describes the scene in detail. The tree looked like it had been pulled apart by giant hands. Donald kept saying it must have been lightning, but there had been no storms. The wood was still warm to the touch, though no fire had been lit. When I pressed my hand against the exposed heartwood, I could feel vibration, like the tree was still resonating from whatever split it. Donald ordered us not to discuss what we'd seen, threatened dismissal for anyone who wrote to the territorial authorities. He was scared. We all were. Knox's sight revealed something worse. They found him. The search party discovered Knox standing upright in a clearing, frozen solid despite temperatures that hadn't been cold enough for such rapid freezing. His hand still gripped his axe. The axe head had been buried in his own chest, driven so deep it emerged from his back and embedded in a tree trunk behind him. He'd been pinned to the tree like a specimen, his body rigid in death. The coroner's report from Tacoma, filed 3 weeks later after the camp finally allowed outside investigation, describes Knox's body in clinical terms. The wound's angle and depth were physically impossible for a self-inflicted injury. The force required to drive an axe completely through a man's torso and into solid wood exceeded human capability. The coroner suggested the body had been positioned after death, staged to create the gruesome tableau the search party discovered. What the report doesn't mention, but what O'Sullivan recorded in his diary, was Knox's expression. His face was locked in concentration, the same focused look the loggers had all seen on Milner's face during his work. Not fear, not pain, not horror at his impending death. Just that distant, listening expression, as if Knox was trying to hear something beyond the range of normal human perception. His eyes were open, O'Sullivan wrote, staring at something above him, something in the canopy. I followed his gaze but saw nothing except branches and gray sky. But I swear I heard it then. That rhythm. That same steady chopping sound Milner made. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding us, echoing through the trees. The other men heard it too. We all ran. Camp 7's Superintendent James Whitmore suspended operations on November 25th. The remaining loggers, 43 men, refused to work. They'd heard what happened to Knox, seen Palmer's destroyed cutting site, knew Stevens was likely dead somewhere in the forest. No amount of wages could convince them to return to the timber. Company records show Whitmore sent an urgent telegram to Seattle headquarters requesting permission to evacuate the camp and relocate operations. The response came within hours. Company executives ordered him to maintain operations, threatened breach of contract penalties that would financially destroy him. The Cascade Timber Company had contracts to fulfill, lumber shipments to deliver. 3 missing men and 1 dead logger didn't justify abandoning valuable timber resources. Whitmore had no choice. He selected 6 men, the ones most desperate for money, and offered them triple wages to continue cutting with Milner. The offer was generous enough to overcome fear. 6 men agreed to spend 1 week maintaining minimum quotas until the company could arrange replacement workers from other camps. O'Sullivan wasn't among them, but he recorded their names in his diary like a memorial. Frank Morrison, Douglas Reed, James Chen, Peter Volkman, Henry Castor, and Robert Shields. All were single men with debts that exceeded their ability to pay through normal wages. All needed money desperately enough to ignore what had happened to their fellow loggers. They reported to their assigned cutting sites on November 26th. Whitmore had organized the sites in a specific pattern, keeping the men close enough to hear each other's work, hoping the proximity would provide safety and prevent further disappearances. Each man was given a whistle, instructed to blow it every hour to confirm his safety. The system worked perfectly the first day. 6 whistles, 6 confirmations. 6 men returning for dinner with acceptable cutting tallies. The second day, the pattern continued, but something was wrong. The men returned to camp silent, their eyes distant, their movements mechanical. They ate without speaking, retired to their bunks without the usual evening conversation. O'Sullivan tried to talk to Morrison, asked him if everything was all right. At his cutting site, Morrison just stared at him for a long moment, then said, "The rhythm. Can you hear it?"
It's always there now, under everything. Once you notice it, you can't stop hearing it.
The third day, none of them returned. The territorial marshal's eventual investigation, prompted by frantic telegrams from families in Tacoma and Seattle, documented what they found. Each man's cutting site formed points of a perfect hexagon in the forest, with Milner's station at the exact center. The sites were located exactly half a mile apart, positioned with geometric precision that suggested deliberate planning and surveying equipment, though no surveying had been done. The 6 sites had been abandoned simultaneously. Tools left in identical positions, axes driven into stumps at the same angle and depth. The similarity was absolute, as if the same person had arranged each site, or as if the 6 men had performed the same actions in perfect unison. In the center of the hexagon, they found evidence of prolonged, intensive activity. Hundreds of trees had been felled in a pattern radiating outward from a single point. But the trees hadn't been cut with axes or saws. They'd been split, torn apart with such violence that the ground was covered in splinters and pulped wood 3 feet deep. Walking through the area meant wading through debris that reached past the knees. But here's what the investigation truly revealed, what the marshal's report buried in technical language and careful phrasing to avoid panic. The trees were still falling. As the search party entered the hexagon's center, they heard it clearly. The rhythmic crack of wood splitting, the crash of timber hitting frozen ground, the steady beat of an axe striking wood. The sounds came from all directions simultaneously, surrounding them in a chorus of invisible labor. But there was no one there. The sounds continued throughout their search, that invisible logger working invisible trees, maintaining that same steady rhythm O'Sullivan had described months before. The marshal ordered his men to search the central area thoroughly, convinced they were missing something obvious. They found Milner's camp, a small clearing where he'd set up a temporary shelter among the fallen timber. His bedroll lay unused. His personal belongings remained untouched. But the ground around his camp told a story of obsessive, unending work. Thousands of axe marks covered the earth, creating patterns that spiraled outward in mathematical precision. The search party found Milner's belongings in his bunk back at the main camp. A single leather satchel containing work clothes and a journal. The journal entries, preserved in the territorial archives, begin normally enough. Milner recorded daily cutting totals, weather conditions, observations about the timber quality and grain patterns. The handwriting is neat, controlled, professional, but the entries deteriorate rapidly. By late October, the text becomes repetitive. Milner writes the same observations about rhythm and pattern dozens of times per page. By early November, whole pages contain only a single phrase, repeated hundreds of times in increasingly erratic script that eventually becomes nearly illegible. The rhythm must continue. The rhythm must continue. The rhythm must continue. The final entry, dated November 27th, breaks this pattern completely. The handwriting returns to its original controlled state. It reads, "I understand now what the previous generations knew. The trees remember. They remember what stood here before the first loggers came, before the first settlements, before humans walked these forests. They remember the old rhythm, the way the forest breathed in its original pattern. Every tree we cut creates silence where sound should be. The silence accumulates like a debt. It demands restoration. I can hear what needs to be done. The cutting must continue, but not their way. Not the company's way. The proper rhythm. The ancient rhythm that maintains the forest's breath. I'll teach the others. We'll restore what was broken. We'll make the forest whole again." The territorial investigation concluded with frustrating ambiguity. 7 men confirmed missing, 1 confirmed dead, no suspect identified, no criminal charges filed. The Cascade Timber Company quietly dissolved Camp 7, reassigned its superintendent to operations in Oregon, and buried the incident in corporate archives that wouldn't be opened for another 80 years. Logging resumed in the area within 2 years under a different company name. Different management. Different camp location carefully positioned several miles from the original Camp 7 site. But the new camps reported persistent problems. Loggers complained about sounds in the forest, that rhythmic chopping that continued through the night, though no crews worked after dark. Trees fell in patterns the men couldn't explain, always in groups of 7, always forming geometric shapes that seemed deliberate. Company foreman noted unusual resistance from the timber itself, as if the trees fought back against the saws and axes. Blades dulled faster than normal. Cutting took longer. Men reported feeling watched while they worked, hearing footsteps in the undergrowth, seeing movement in their peripheral vision that vanished when they turned to look. A forest ranger's report from 1903 describes finding an abandoned cutting site near where Camp 7 once stood. 7 trees had been felled in a perfect circle. In the circle's center stood a single enormous Douglas fir, untouched by axes but marked with deep cuts, forming an intricate pattern that covered the entire trunk. The ranger couldn't decipher the pattern's meaning, but he noted its precision suggested deliberate work, perhaps ceremonial carving by local tribes. Except the local Puyallup representatives, when shown photographs, denied any knowledge of the symbols. They did mention something else, a story their elders told about certain places in the forest where the old rhythm still persisted, where the trees maintained patterns from before human settlement, places where the forest still breathed in its original way, and anything that disrupted that breathing would be corrected. Forcibly. Modern forestry surveys reveal tree core samples in a 6-square-mile area around the former Camp 7 location, showing synchronized growth rings beginning in 1895. The last documented sighting came from a surveyor in 1907 who followed the sound of axe work for 3 hours until he found a cutting site. Freshly worked, 7 trees split lengthwise. An axe stood buried in a stump, still vibrating from its last blow, the handle warm despite the morning cold. He heard it then, a rhythm, not from the axe, but from the trees themselves. A pulse like breathing, like a heartbeat. He left the axe where it stood and marked the area as unsuitable for logging. The Forest Service still maintains that designation. On quiet mornings, hikers report hearing something that sounds almost like chopping, that same rhythm, never stopping, never slowing. And every few years, someone finds fresh cutting sites in areas no logging company has touched in over a century. 7 trees, always 7, split from the inside out, the axes standing ready for whoever comes to learn the proper rhythm.